Welcome to class 7, where with this shot, I will show you how to do hair roto. With this shot here, I need to isolate my subject from the background using articulated shapes. I could try some extraction methods, but to get proper isolation, I would probably end up using roto due to the color and the detail of the background. Okay, so I'm going to slow this down a little bit and study the shot. So I think here I'm going to need a combination of all types of mats here: articulates, core mats, open shapes. I've articulated the face and the torso first already, and then I made core mats for the head and the hair, trying to isolate the solid parts where you don't see through the hair to the background. So here I've done that already, so now we can focus on the hair roto. I will turn this up to speed. And I'll turn on the tool overlay. Okay, so here you can see I've done the hair core shapes, and I've done the articulates for the torso, the face, and the hand. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to start by looking for clumps of hair that don't really change a lot, or that don't separate into other strands. And I think this the end section here is a good place to start. So I'm going to zoom in, and I can start making a couple of closed hair shapes. Click B for the B-spline. I'll just make sure that I'll turn off the feathering right now, Alt F. I'm going to make sure that my shape is overlapped inside the core mat. And we'll zoom in. Select the transform tool and just try to use my arrow keys to put that in place, and so I don't get too much chattering with points, and see what I can get away with. So there's nothing real special about this shape. It's just another articulated closed shape. And I'm not doing any blurring of edges or feathering for these types of shapes at this point. I do all my articulate hardage first, and then I go back and turn on the motion blur to check edge qualities, and maybe add a little blur to the shape edges just for visual reference, but then I'll turn that off later before I'm exporting my shapes. Okay, so I'm going to turn on the shapes that I've done already. I'm going to turn this off, and we'll go, I've turned on my layer of closed hair shapes. Okay, so first we'll take a look at this shape here. I don't have any feathering on it, but we'll talk about the motion blur. So it's a good time to bring out Roto Overlay tool. So I'm going to select my shape. I call this example so I know which one. And to see all the features of this tool properly, you need to turn on the motion blur for the shape itself in the object list, and you also need to go to the node parameters and you enable the motion blur there. And now you can see here, so this is the red is the onion skinning, so that's the path of the shape. And the motion blur is yellow. We'll just turn that on real quick. Let me just zoom in here so you can see that. Let me turn on the motion blur for the shape. There we go. So this yellow dotted line, which is here motion blur, that is the motion blur edge. We can go to the tool overlay here and alpha, and now you can see, if I'll turn this off, the motion blur. So that looks real nice. I'll turn that back on. And then we have the motion path in green. So this is a really helpful tool to check your work. So I'm going to turn that off for now, and I'm going to disable motion blur on my shape and within the node parameters box because it's very processor intensive. Okay, so then while I didn't feel like I needed edge feathering on this shape, I did want to put it on a couple of other shapes. So the edge feathering is on top of edge blur and the motion blur. So if we zoom in here, you can see like on this shape here, let me just unlock this. I put a little bit of extra feathering on that because I felt like it needed it. Yeah, but another thing to keep in mind is if you're going to use your shapes inside of Silhouette for your comping, or if you're going to be exporting them to another program or another artist, you want to keep in mind about how much you're going to use the feathering, because it's processor intensive and you might want to leave some of this edge detail for the comping process, because you might want to have it be a little bit more interactive when you're doing your comping over your final background. But sometimes it's good to experiment with the edges being blurred and feathered. And then, like I said, you just turn them off before, turn off the edge blur itself before you're exporting them or giving them to another artist. But sometimes I actually make a copy of my roto and I either export that or I just copy paste the roto node here. So I have an extra copy before I start the feathering. So if I end up too far down in the process and I don't like what I'm doing, I can start over. Because feathering's not something you can turn on or off like a button for motion blur. And another thing to think about with feathering as well is that it can be done either globally with a whole shape. If we can just turn on the feather handles here. Actually, I'll just start with this one. So it can be done globally on the whole like that. Or you can do a selected group of points you just want. So we'll just do this shape here. Or you can just do it per point. And this can also be keyframed as well. But I'll show you a little bit more of this later when I'm doing some of the larger strands of hair later on in the shot that will have a lot of edge feathering. Okay, so the last thing to talk about with the blur is that there's like 3 types of blur. There's the edge blur, the motion blur, and the feathering. So for example, if I go to this shape here, we can go back to, I'll just Command Z and undo the feathering. And turn off the feather handles real quick. So if I select this shape and I go down to the object list, you can see here, this is my edge blur. And so I have it set to 2. I'll turn on the alpha overlay without. And you can see it's soft. If it was, if there was no blur at all on the edge, it would be 0. And that's how I export my mats typically, but I'm going to change it back to 2, kind of gauge how it's going to look. And then I'm going to also, if I wanted to see the motion blur, like I said, I can turn it on like this. And then for the node, and the last thing I wanted to mention that if you wanted to change the qualities of your motion blur, this is where you can do that as well. And if you wanted to see all of your shapes with motion blur at the same time, an easy way to do that is just to come into the object list window here and select all, and then click the icon here. That turns on the motion blur for everything. You can see that changed, and then the motion blur here is already checked. So that's a quick way to just check it on and off, and you don't have to click individual shapes. So I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to go back here. Everything is still selected, and you can see it's already turned off. So it's kind of like, let me go to the node here, and then we disable that. So object list and object window, I should say, and the node. Okay, so then we'll just deselect all of those. Okay, so let's start with the more simple kinds of open shapes for hair. I am going to find a section where we can start experimenting. I'm going to take the gamut down a little bit, holding down the Control Command key for a little finer tuning there, finer increments. Okay. So here I have an area where I want to make a couple of open shapes for hair. I'm going to choose the B key. First I can just close that, and maybe we'll just make them in a layer. And the minimum requirement to turn on the tool overlay here, and I'll probably turn off this core so we can see a little bit better. The minimum requirement is 3 points, and you can use any of the spline types here. And then click R or the escape key to get out of the adding more points mode. Click B again. And then Click R to get that edit mode, and then you have your open shapes. And I do not assign a width yet to my open shapes until I'm done with the articulation process, because it gets a little bit hard to see, and I'll show you right here. If I'm on the spline, okay, I want that to be a stroke width of 2. And then it gets harder to actually see the hair. So I just keep this at 0 for now, and then when I'm done, like if I have a bunch of shapes inside a layer, I just select them all at once, and I usually do them in layers where I want the same parameters, and then I can just change the stroke width to 2 all at once, or give them a blur all at once, or that's the idea. But I'll just reset that. And the blur doesn't so much matter, and then if I can, you just try to edit the shapes all at once. Select them, transform tool, and put them into place. You can see that this wasn't lined up to begin with, but we'll change that. Actually, what we can do is that sometimes you can make one shape here, and if it moves similarly to another piece of hair, you can just duplicate that and multi-frame it. So we can try that. Let's just delete this one that's not in place. And then we'll just articulate this shape right here. Back to the beginning. Doesn't quite move so fluidly. It's just a little bit erratic. Okay, so I have my one shape there, and now I want to have another shape that's for this piece right here. I know it's very faint, it's hard to see, so I'm going to select my shape, Command D, and then I'm going to lock my original shape here, right there, and select that. Click M for the multi-frame tool. And you see this red border, and I don't have to be on a keyframe to do this. And then I'm going to move my shape where the other one is, and I might just kind of do that. Okay, and click the M again, so I'm out of the multi-frame tool. And now you see I have 2 pieces of hair that are near each other. They sort of move similarly, and I didn't have to articulate a second shape. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about these kinds of hair open shapes and what's keyframeable or not. So I'm going to make another shape, B, and I'm going to make another hair shape there, click R, and I'm going to just move that into place. And I'm going to articulate that across the shot a little bit. Okay, so now I have a choice. You have some choices for your open shapes. Down in the object list here, I'm done with my shape, and I'm going to assign it a width. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to show for example purposes. So maybe with a 5, and maybe I gave that a blur of like 2. And then I can choose either flat or round cap style. So this is not keyframeable, so you should decide whether you want flat or round, but I mean, you can change your mind later. You just can't have both with the same shape. But the stroke width is keyframeable, and the blur is keyframe. Anything here you see with the little watch dial here is, or the time icon is keyframeable. Okay, so here I have this shape, and it's a flat cap. And if I'm going through and I decide, well, I actually don't want, I want it to be a point at the end of the piece of hair. So I can, but I've already keyframed my shape. So the options here, I'm going to Alt F and turn on the feathering. So now you can see here is the feathering tool, and here is the width tool. So if I want this to be a point, then I can just close that up, and now you see I have a point for the end of the hair. But then now you see also here that on my next keyframe, it's flat again, I want the point. So the way to do that, you could leave it that way if you wanted it to be separate, but I'm just going to Command Z here, get back to the flat, and I'm going to turn on again the multi-frame tool, have the red border, and I'm going to just make this a point. And now you can see that I have a point across the rest of my keyframes and the shot. So sometimes I will keep this to the end because if I just want to make some quick shapes first, I don't want to always be zooming in and changing this as well. I just want to do my articulation, and this is all something I do when I'm all done. And you can do the same with the feathering. So you can have per point feathering, and it's keyframeable. But I'm on the multi-frame tool, and I'll get out of that, and I'll just, for this keyframe, I'll pull that in. So now you can see that the feathering changes over time. So yeah, okay. All right, so another thing to mention is that hair roto can be very labor intensive. So you want to try to be as efficient as possible. I'm going to delete this layer because we don't need this anymore. And I'm going to go to see if I can take advantage of tracking to help me out with making a bunch of splines. So I see here in the beginning that this group of hairs on the top of the head, they don't move a lot from each other. So I thought if I can track some of that area, then maybe I can just throw all those shapes in a layer. So that's what I'm going to try. I'm going to make a layer here. I'm going to go to the circle tool, and I'm going to make a shape. At the top, I'm going to turn off the feathering for now. And I'm going to select a tracker, Shift T, and I'm going to choose the Mocha tracker down here. And I'm just going to go with the default. And I'm going to track this forward. And I'm going to keep my cursor over the cancel button so that when it starts to fail, I can just cancel it. So now I'm going to start tracking forward. See how far I get. Okay, I think it's starting to fail there. And now I'm just going to delete the keyframes I don't want. I'm going to go to the timeline down here. I'm going to go to the last good frame. Maybe. Let's see how far I get. So I'm going to just delete the ones after that. Down here, select them, Shift Select, and my cursor is inside the timeline. And I'm going to click the delete key. So now I just have this area that I'm going to use. So I'm going to go to the first frame. I'm here in my layer. I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to just take this down a little bit more, the camera. And I'm going to make some hair shapes. So I'm going to turn off my tracking shape. I'm going to make sure also that when I'm making my open shapes that they're going to overlap far enough into my hair core mat. So if I wanted to see, just to make sure I could turn that on. Okay, yes, I'm overlapped because you don't want pieces of hair sticking outside the core, or especially both sides. All right, I'm going to just turn, I guess I can probably just leave that on, but I'm going to turn this off for now. Hair core shapes. Now we're going to make some more shapes. Click the B key. I'm going to do just a little bit of editing here. Make sure that the pieces of hair are actually attached to a piece of hair. Okay, so now I have all of my shapes inside my tracked layer, and let's see how they follow along. Okay, so that's they're following pretty good. So maybe just a couple keyframes, and if I had to keyframe something, I would select them all as a group, select the T for the transform tool, and just nudge them into place with my arrow keys. So that's a quick way to make a group of hairs without doing them individually. And then again, when I'm ready to, I'm done articulating, I want to change all the parameters. I do them all at once together down in the object window down here. Okay, now that we've done some closed hair shapes and some thin open hair shapes, I'm going to zoom out and we can start working on some of the larger strands. I'm going to just brighten this up a little bit here. And I'm going to delete this layer because we don't need it anymore. I'm going to zoom out so I can frame the viewer. Okay, so now we have the shot where the hair is whipping across the screen. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an open shape for some of these larger groups of hair, because they it's not just one strand, but it's a group of strands that would do well with an open shape. It's almost like using a closed shape, but since you can vary the width and the feather, it's really helpful. And you're just animating one line. You're not animating lots of points over a closed shape. So let's pick a shape. How about this piece right here? I'm going to click the B key. I'm going to start up here, and I'm just going to try to follow the shape of the hair. But for in this case, I am going to start the feathering and the width process right off the bat, because how I do with this shape is going to affect how I do the next shape. So this is the little more creative, labor-intensive part. I'm going to turn on the feather handles, Alt F. So when I select here, you can see that I have, oh, first I have to assign a width. Okay, so I'm just going to give this like 5. Okay, now I have the width. I'll turn on, let's see if they're already selected. Okay, Alt F. And now I can start. I know I'm going to want this to be a point. I'll fix that later because that was selected with the other point. And then I'll just begin making my shape. So for right now, I'm not going to turn on the motion blur yet. I'm just going to go through a couple keyframes. Select the shape as a whole, T, and I'm going to W and rotate it from the pivot. Bring this up here, and at this point, I'm going to multi-frame tool, and I'm going to make this a point right now. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to do a little bit of feathering, and then I'm going to check the motion blur. I can click on 4 to see the color comp. So now I can see how the feathering is starting to look. So I'm going to click the next to icon, the motion blur icon there, and I'm going to go down to the node, and I'm going to click the enable there. So now you can see it's a little more pronounced. And so you just want to make sure that you kind of get an idea of how wide it's going to be, and then you can just keep doing your feathering, and then you can come back and do some adjustments after that. So I'm going to go back to the foreground. It's important, if you can, to try to roto in the foreground view because it's less processing. I'll turn off the motion blur here and here as well. You can see it gets very transparent. So when it's very transparent, I'm just going to make my shape width smaller, and I'm going to bring out the feather a little bit more. So this is more of a specialty thing. Like I said, it's processor intensive, so it's not something you would do on every shot. And you would definitely have to check down the line how it was going to be used, because it's possible that this type of edge quality might be done, like I said, later on inside of the comp. Okay, so I won't go through all of the shapes, but I'll show you my final in a little bit. And something to keep in mind too, that all these different open shapes, they can be exported to Nuke and they can retain their same edge qualities. Okay, so one more thing I want to show you here before I move on to the next thing is that you can see I have some of these shapes outside. So that is when I'm actually turning off the shapes. You can either leave your shapes inside of your image or you can drag them outside. It's really a personal preference. So if I zoom in here, I'll show you kind of what I'm doing. And we'll just turn on some of these closed hair shapes here. So if I don't need a shape anymore, I turn it off. I leave it in frame for one more frame, and then I pull it off screen. I have a little Python script that is automatically loaded in from an environment variable inside the environment preferences that links my Python scripts from my Dropbox. So when I open Silhouette, my scripts are automatically loaded in, executed, and they overwrite any hotkey shortcuts that are set in the keybinds py file. So the reason why I do this is because let's just find an example. Okay, so for this piece of hair here, let's find it. 61. Okay, here it is. And I used it, but now I don't want it anymore. And so I can either leave it inside, and you can turn it off that way as well. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But so if I don't want it, it's inside my image. I'm just going to drag it off screen and keep it on for a little bit, like another frame for motion blur. So to turn it off though, before I pull it off screen, I have to click the opacity icon here, which is in the object list. It's in the roto icon list next to the shape. But I find that to be sometimes I click the wrong shape or I am clicking the wrong icon. So my Python script is Alt-O to toggle the opacity on and off. So if you look here and I click Alt-O, you can see that the opacity is toggling on and off. So I find that really handy. I don't have to worry about clicking the wrong thing, especially if I have a whole group of shapes, or if I have a bunch of splines, like if I had a lot of those hair splines on the top, but then the tracking stopped working. Do I still want to use all those hair splines or have them hanging around here? Or even if they're off, they can still be in here. Instead, I can have them all selected and then click Alt-O, and I know that they're going to be off altogether. If I can't see them all, if I have so many shapes inside my object list and they're selected here, but I can't see them here, or I can't see them all in here, I know that if they're all selected, that in here inside the viewer, that the proper action is happening inside with the opacity. But you don't have to drag them off screen like me. It's just a preference that I've had since I started rotoing. You can leave them on and just turn them off, and they will not be they won't be visible. You can set a preference in the shape preferences called Fade Outline with Opacity. Then Silhouette will draw unselected and inactive shape outlines using the shape opacity value. And the V key toggles this preference on and off so that you can easily see any shapes that are at 0% opacity. But like I said, my workflow is just to pull them off screen. Okay. All right, so the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you a little test of my final roto. And after that, I'm going to open up a separate file to show you the finished shapes, but that's going to be, it's a different project because it's a little bit memory intensive, and it's easier if I just do it a little bit separately. But so right here, I will show you the finished, it's like just a little comp test of the roto. So you see we have a lot of this detail, a lot of the nice blur. This is rendered with motion blur. So it's edge blur, motion blur and feathering. We can look at alpha, overlay, and then we can also look at the straight alpha. So you have all this nice hair detail here and here, plus the feathering and the motion blur. Okay, so now I will stop this and I will open up my final project and be right back. Okay, so here is my final project. I have my source and then my roto node. I'm selected, I'm in the view foreground right here so that we can play it through and it won't be slow. And now you can see all of my shapes. There's got to be hundreds of shapes in here. So here I have all of my open shapes here for the hair. These are all open shapes. And I've animated them. I've started them here and they've crossed over the face and onto the other side. And I've also kept in, just to compare, a closed shape here. But that was a lot more work. There's a lot of more points that I had to edit as opposed to just using one line for my shape. Here in the object list, you can see that you can just have hundreds of shapes in here. And here's the timeline. I can bring that up. So there's a lot going on. It was a little bit of a shorter shot, and I thought it would benefit from doing the hair roto. And this is the final. So here I have a little demo here where I want to show you how to paint using the Roto Show Shapes feature. I'm going to pretend like it's a finished shot, but I have some edges that I need to paint. And you can see over here, we're going to focus on this area over here, where I have some dark edges around her fingers that I need to paint out. So I can either just try to paint that with my clone tool and trying not to eat into any of these edges. But you can actually use roto shapes as a mask. So here we have our source, and here we have a roto node and a paint node here. And this setup is actually a session template. You can, so for example, new session, and then we've been working mostly with the roto template, but here it's roto paint. And if you select that, then you get this setup right here. So I have my source, I have my roto, and then I have a paint node after that that's hooked up like that. So this will allow me to see my roto shapes when I'm painting. And how we do that is that I click the Show Shapes button down here in the Paint tab. So now you can see that I can see my my shapes. So what we're going to do now is set it up where I can use these roto shapes as a mask. First, I'm going to select the shapes up here, and I'm going to give them like a blur on the edge so that when I'm painting into them, that it's a little bit blurry. It's not hard edge. So go to roto. I can, here's the forefinger that's set as a 2. We'll see how that works. And then this is, let's see what that is. That is the middle finger, and we'll give that a blur. Okay, so we'll go back to the paint tab here, and we'll get this set up. So we have our show shapes button checked here. I'm going to turn off subpixel. I never paint with this turned on because I find it too blurry. And we're going to click obey alpha, but we're going to invert the alpha because if I clicked this, I would be painting inside the roto, but I really want to paint outside, only the outside area. So I'm going to click invert alpha. I'm going to set, I don't think I need to worry too much about this, but I'll set that to output. I'm going to change my softness all the way to 100. That's typically how I paint. I'm going to set my my size of my brush a little smaller. Then I'm going to find a clone source. So I have a dark edge here. Let's zoom in a little bit. And I can probably use the next frame because it's nice and clean. So I'm going to set my source as the next one. I'm going to caps lock. Now I need to line it up. that into place. And now I can start painting. So now you see that things disappear. And the reason they do is because I have a preference set in my paint preferences where when I paint that the lines disappear, the rotor shapes disappear, and my cursor disappears. So if I painting, you can see there's paint going on, but you can't see the lines. And what I really like that is that I can see the edges when I'm painting and I'm not distracted by the blue lines. So that preference is here. I'll open up the preferences. So in paint, I have hide brush outline while painting, and I find that really useful. Click OK. So let's, so you can see, we can go see that's what it was, and now that's what it looks like. We'll turn off the overlay here. We'll turn off the show shapes. So before and after. So that is a great way to use the show shapes feature when you are painting.